I think most Americans were sort of raised to think that the centerpiece of a meal is meat and everything else is secondary. For the sake of health, both in the short term and the long, and planetary health, which we frankly should be talking about too, is arguably the signature issue of our time, we should reverse that. And the centerpiece should be a variety of plant foods with or without the meat. And you don't need it at all, but if you are going to include it in your diet, it should play a secondary role.
Let's double click on your recommendation to specifically reduce intake of beef. Is that because of the connection with planetary health?
For me, it is. And it's also because of the ethics of how we treat animals to produce our food. And I think everybody's obligated to be aware of that. At this point, there are lots of different sources of information about the brutality of concentrated animal feeding organizations, CAFOs, and factory farming. And, so many of us have pets. We have cats or dogs. We have other mammals that are part of our families, other species that we love. They're not all that different from beef cattle. In my case, in addition to dogs, I have horses. They're a lot like cows in terms of how they perceive the world, and that's when I first encountered this issue, was riding horses out west and seeing cattle who were being raised as food, and I thought, one of you is a dear friend and one of you somebody's dinner. Kind of have a problem with that. My eyes were open to the true brutality of concentrated animal feeding organizations by John Robbins in his book, The Food Revolution. It kind of changed my perspective, and there was no going back. So you could argue the ethics of it, and I think that's very important. But yes, for me, I think the signature issue of our time is that this is the only planet we're ever going to share. And we are rapidly making it inhospitable to ourselves and the other creatures that have the misfortune of sharing this time with us. And one of the major contributions each of us can control when we sit down to eat is our intake of beef. When you compare the environmental footprint of beef to other foods, it's pretty much off the charts. You have to go to a logarithmic scale to put beef on the same chart as everything else. A huge amount of water utilization, a huge amount of land utilization, and in particular, a massive association with greenhouse gas emissions, so a direct contribution to climate change, which then in turn makes it harder to produce all the other foods we need to feed a global population of 8 billion plus. So the ethics of raising beef for human consumption, pretty questionable. And by the way, it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not saying it's unethical for humans to be omnivores. I'm saying that factory farming is unethical. It's brutal. It's cruel. And I don't think any decent person wants wanton cruelty on the menu. And this, by the way, is not just about beef, but also about pigs and poultry. So, just the terrible treatment of any fellow creature should trouble us. But then our excess intake of beef contributes to almost all the major chronic conditions that plague humans in America and in the modern world, and this outsized associated environmental footprint. So, these are the three critical windows I think we should look through when we weigh up our dietary choices. What are the direct effects on human health? How are we treating our fellow creatures? And what are the implications for planetary health? And you basically have three big X's for beef, which may not mean eat none, because if we all ate none or a lot less, then we would be producing a lot less. And we would be able to produce it in a way that is not as environmentally harmful and not as cruel to the animals, and lesser intake would still be consistent with human health. So again, it's not an all or none choice, but however much beef you're eating, if you're eating beef, think about eating less.
It's an interesting conversation because I think most people tend to agree with what you're putting forward there about CAFOs from an ethical perspective, and are of the view that it would be more ethical to raise these animals differently in different environments. Where I think it gets a little more debated is that there seems to be this message from people that it's not the cow, it's the how. And we can, in fact, double down on our meat consumption if we were to just shift to kind of more extensive regenerative farming type practices. But when I've at least double clicked on that, it seems that there still is significant planetary health issues there, particularly around land use, if the consumption of beef wasn't to decrease at the same time.
So a couple of comments there. First, when I have the expertise I need to answer a question, I'm not shy about saying so. When I don't, I turn to people who do. In this case, the person I rely on most is Guidon Echelle at Barnard College. I think he's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about specific environmental impacts of animal husbandry, different forms of agriculture. He's written some quite scholarly papers on the exaggerated benefits of regenerative agriculture. Not that there isn't a there, but it actually tends to be less efficient in terms of mass of beef produced per unit, hectare, acre, space in the world than factory farming. The reason for factory farming is its incredible economic efficiency. It's good business. So that alternative argument, we can double down. We can even eat more beef. Well, yeah, but you're producing it now by means that require much larger swaths of land. And so you're taking over what could have been land used for other purposes, potentially available to wild animals, and turning it into pasture land, which, by the way, is what we're doing in the Amazon rainforest. We're burning down the Amazon rainforest to create pasture land, to raise cattle to satisfy the global demand for beef. So I think it's a complete misdirection. I think there's an argument about regenerative agriculture that's legitimate. But part of what allows regenerative agriculture to be part of a viable, sustainable world is that the total volume of beef consumption goes down, so you're not dependent on factory farming. So it's a reduction in volume, total beef consumption either way. And then I think regenerative agriculture can be part of that discussion.
This topic of animal versus plant foods, if you want to put it that way, continues to be hotly debated. And in 2019, I think it was, you debated Nina Teicholz on this very question: are vegetarians healthier than omnivores? Looking back from today's perspective, now 6 years down the road, how do you think that debate went?
Well, it wasn't pleasant because I happened to be debating somebody who was focused more on attempted character assassination than content. But any well-structured debate has a resolution that you're debating, and the resolution that we were asked to debate was there is little or no evidence that there are benefits from plant-based diets. And I took the position that that resolution was false. And I presented a massive amount of evidence of the health benefits of plant-based diets, both vegetarian and vegan and low animal food versions of flexitarian and so forth. Just went through a litany of randomized controlled trials. I said, it's just a fact. You can decide you don't like these studies. You can decide you wish they reached a different conclusion, but you can't pretend they don't exist. The resolution was there's little or no evidence. So I've just given you dozens of randomized controlled trials to say nothing of the observational epidemiology. So objectively, I won the debate. There was a vote before and after, and I won. So I think it went fine. I think the truth prevailed. To me, it had nothing to do with who was debating whom. It was the topic. The topic won because the evidence is there. And refutation of the evidence does not make it go away. Those trials have been conducted. Those papers have been published. And the evidence is really overwhelming. The other thing that I would note is that, from my point of view, the best evidence about the benefits of plant-predominant diets extend beyond any one measure of human health and do look at biodiversity and do look at ethics. I think it is to the discredit of humans to engage in wanton cruelty toward other species. It's shameful. So I think that's relevant too. I think if we know that one dietary approach results in cruelty and abuse of other creatures and another dietary approach does not, that latter dietary approach is favored. I think the planetary implications are absolutely critical. What are we doing to aquifers? What are we doing to rainforests? What are we doing to biodiversity? Also critical. None of that was part of the debate. It was just that one lens, just about health. So even through that one lens, the answer was clear and the truth prevailed. So, in that sense, the debate went fine, but I don't think the debate covered the requisite terrain. I think we no longer have the luxury of asking questions about diet as if it didn't have implications for planetary health. Because once we run out of planet, we're all cooked. And debates about diet will be moot. We're going to have a hard enough time producing adequate quantities of food, to say nothing of the quality, once we've destroyed the hospitability of Earth for all the things we're used to growing and consuming. And we're headed in that direction with ever more drought and flood and unpredictability. So I think in many ways the debate was too constrained. I don't think we can unbundle human and planetary health. But I debated within the parameters I was given. And again, the truth prevailed because the volume of evidence available on this topic truly is quite overwhelming. And it's not because plants are good and animal foods are evil. In a world of hunter-gatherers where both are part of the mix and there's no cruelty there and there's enough to go around, we wouldn't be having such a debate. But we're talking about a world where we have concentrated animal feeding organizations and factory farming, and it's hard to get people to eat fruits and vegetables. And we tend not to grow a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. We have massive monocultures to feed beef and poultry and pigs so that we can eat them. So there's just these massive distortions in both food consumption and food production, leading to tremendous imbalances. And as has become thematic in this discussion, imbalance is bad.
Do you think that there was anything in that debate that you could have said or put forward that might have changed Nina's views?
No, I think her views are, first of all, I don't have any particular interest in talking about her, and my interest was not in changing her views. She came with an agenda. I think there's a famous aphorism that it's very hard to get somebody to understand a thing when their livelihood depends on them not understanding that thing, right? There are different versions of that aphorism, but that's the gist of it, right? You're not going to get the aha moment when the person that you're trying to share the epiphany with has a vested interest in not believing that it's true. So, I think there are lots of people who built their careers about these extreme positions. I like to think I'm not one of them. So, I'm not radically in favor of any given dietary pattern. And what I do professionally applies an objective measure of diet quality across the spectrum, from low carb and paleo and keto all the way to vegan and everything in between. And I think we can meet everybody where they are. The simple fact is that in the modern world, we tend to eat too much meat, so eating less is a good thing for just about everybody.
I recently ran my full labs through Function Health, and I have to say the results were eye-opening. Turns out my ApoB was higher than ideal, probably thanks to a little too much coconut yogurt. I also found out I was slightly low in copper, something that I would have never suspected without testing. On the flip side, my biological age came back 13.3 years younger than my actual age, a calculation based on the work of aging researcher Dr. Morgan Levine. So all in all, I've got a few tweaks to make to optimize my lipids and nutrient status, but overall my blood work says I'm doing pretty well. That's what I love about Function. You get access to over 160 biomarkers covering everything from hormones and inflammation to nutrients, toxins, cardiovascular risk, and more. And all your results are housed in one beautiful platform, all tracked over time. Once you get your results, you can make informed changes before small issues become big ones. To get started, head to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. The first 1,000 people get a $100 credit toward their membership. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill.